Welcome to this joint committee meeting. Just to note, in terms of housekeeping, so it is a mixed meeting. So being live streamed, we have a number of attendees via Zoom. So just for even make sure everyone uses their microphones, normal criteria applies. Use your microphone so those on Zoom can hear, and those on Zoom, if you put your hands up, hopefully I will see them if you wish to speak at the appropriate stages throughout the meeting. So with that, I'll just open with karakia. Kia tau mai te maramatanga, kia tau mai te rangimari e, kia tau mai te kaha, me te aro mō tēnei kaupapa hui e, pai ki e. We have apologies from councillors Chris Hill and Mark Greening from Tasman, and Deputy Mayor Rohan O'Neill-Stevens, and Pete Rainey and Campbell Rollo from Nelson. Could someone please move that they be accepted? So move Councillor Courtney, seconded Mayor Smith. All those in favour, please say aye. In terms of the order of business, there is just the one item today, so that keeps it nice and simple. So that's the consideration of the joint Nelson-Tasman Speed Management Plan. Are there any declarations of interest in relation to the item on today's agenda? No, there is no public forum. So at this point, I would now like to ask Lyndon Hammond, who is going to introduce the agenda item, supported by a number of people. So Lyndon, I'll hand over to you, maybe very brief introductions of the team that you have at the table with you, and then I'll just hand over to you to introduce the item.
Through the chair, thank you. So we've got teams from Tasman and Nelson here. We've got Bill and Jane from Tasman. We've got Reese and myself, and of course Dwayne from Tasman as well. We'd start with a short presentation, which we hope will introduce this subject. Reese will start with that, and then we'll move to Jane. And at the end of the presentation, we can add some salient points from the other presenters, and then we can move from there. So I'll hand over to Reese.
Through the chair, thank you, Lyndon. Oh, hang on. Yeah. Have I turn it on? Yeah, no, I've just got it. So today we're obviously talking about a speed management plan, and I guess there's two key things in terms of the purpose of this meeting is to share some of the outcomes in the draft speed limit setting rule that was been recently released, and also approve the recommendation from the Joint Regional Transport Committee, which is the joint Nelson-Tasman Speed Management Plan. In terms of how we've got to this point, there's been many steps, as you can see on the slide there, and I guess we started even prior to that first bullet point there around the direction setting with the RTC, with quite a considerable amount of community feedback over several years around the desire for some slower speeds in locations around the region. Prior to the formation and prior to the community engagement, we did some pre-engagement with schools and stakeholders through August and September in 2023. And then we started our formal engagement. It was a special consultative procedure in December, and we ran that for quite a period over the Christmas period through into February this year. Now, during that particular set of engagement, we had a number of sessions. We were in person in the libraries for many sessions around the district. We attended A&P shows, we attended markets, the Nelson Car Show, bikers breakfasts, and held some online meetings. And I guess we gathered a lot of information from the community. I think it was 2,400 odd submissions in total. The RTC had their hearings in April, and then following that, we've had individual workshops with respective councils. Nelson on the 20th of May and Tasman had a couple of different sessions. And then at that point, we had a draft speed limit rule released from the coalition government on the 13th of June, which I guess changed the landscape quite a bit. And we'll talk about that some more as we go through these slides. The RTC then considered the way forward and deliberated on the 9th of July with the plan that is before you today, and we're now at this meeting. And I guess the next step would be, depending on the outcome of this meeting, submitting the speed management plan through to the Director of Transport. So I guess the key thing is this has been quite a considerable piece of work over the course of the last year, if not longer, to get to this point. Speed management, what is the speed management plan, I guess, is the title of this slide. So back in 2022, previous government released a rule requiring a speed management plan, and that had a 10-year vision with a 3-year implementation plan for how you might have speeds in the district. It had specific requirements around schools and had to take account of guidance from Waka Kotahi. And then that more recent draft rule that's been released from the coalition government retained the framework of the earlier rule, but brought in, I guess, a far greater requirement to consider the economic impacts of slower speeds on the network. The draft rule also requires a road-by-road economic analysis, so like a benefit cost analysis for each road when you're considering changes, and it no longer made a speed management plan mandatory. It's now optional. So that slide there is just to show some of the changes. I guess probably one thing that is worth pointing out is in the school space, the draft rule requires the speed limits to be variable, not permanent, around the schools. So that's an important point we'll touch on as we go through. So I think you have probably mostly seen this slide before, but we're caught in a bit of a conundrum around timing and risk with this speed management plan. We've got the Minister encouraging us to consider the rule before making final decisions, but we've had our community over the course of the last, probably 2 or 3 years wanting changes to speed limits in certain locations. And we also have an RTC that has recommended the speed management plan that's before you that is recommending that we submit prior to the final rule comes out. And the reason for that is if we submit under the old rule, it avoids us having to reconsult and undertake costly cost-benefit analysis on a road-by-road basis, both which would be needed under the draft rule, and I guess that will further frustrate our community who've been asking for changes for some time. So the recommendation from the RTC is to make some changes outside the schools and in specific locations, both across the urban and rural space. And we've sent out some maps more recently to give you a sense of where that is. And we're including within the speed management plan changes that are both allowed under the draft rule and anticipated. But we've also got a few changes that aren't currently allowed under the draft rule, but we have advocated for those changes in our submission to central government, and specifically that's around what in Nelson we call the home zone. So that's where we have urban roads that have no footpaths, typically end of cul-de-sacs, where we think a much more appropriate speed is 30 kilometres an hour. And then we would review once the final rule comes out. And if that is enabled through hopefully the power of our submission, we would do those changes. If not, we wouldn't. now I'd just like to briefly, I guess, try and get a bit of a summary. There's quite a bit of text there. It'll be a bit tricky to read, but I'll summarise the key points. So when we went out and talked with the community December through February, we presented 4 options in the urban space, and I'll talk about the rural on the next slide. And they ranged from option A, which was the kind of the do minimum position around changing some speeds around the schools, right through to a 30k speed limit across majority of our urban space, except the urban connectors, and that was option D. You'll see in this slide here that option A, the top option there, had more than majority support at 60% from the community. It did, however, have a negative cost-benefit ratio, and what we actually found through our economic analysis that all 4 options, in fact, in the urban space had a negative cost-benefit ratio. Option D, however, did start to get some reasonable crash savings, you can see there. Now, when we look at those 4 options, the only option that we can really proceed with under the draft rule is option A around the schools, and that's why it's got that red box around it. Option B effectively involved proceeding with option A plus some broader areas at 30 kilometres an hour focused around our busy commercial areas, and often we were linking schools that were adjacent with a broader 30k zone. Unfortunately, under the draft rule, that wouldn't be allowed. And also options C and D. C was a blanket 40 kilometre an hour approach, and option D, a 30 kilometre an hour blanket approach. They'll both be viewed as blanket approaches under the draft rule and couldn't be proceeded with. I've got a similar slide in the rural space. Again, option 1 is that do minimum where we were proposing to the community just to change outside schools. Option 2 is largely where we have landed with the RTC and what is in the recommendation. And options 3 and 4, again, would be viewed as blanket approaches under the draft rule. I think the key points that I'd like to make here is that in the rural space, our economic analysis showed that you would get some pretty reasonable crash savings and pretty reasonable benefit cost ratios by making these changes, as opposed to in the urban space. And that's because the crashes typically in the rural environment have a higher severity and a worse outcome. And also when you're travelling a wee bit faster, the vehicle operating cost, above 70 kilometres an hour comes into play. So what does that mean? So I'm just going to summarise, I guess, at a high level what that means for Nelson, and then hand over to Jane to talk about what that means at a high level for Tasman. So for Nelson, what the RTC is proposing is that we would change the speed limits outside all of the schools that currently have variable limits. So pretty much all of our schools, bar 3 or 4, have a variable speed limit now, and that currently is 40 kilometres an hour when school is coming and going at the beginning and the end of the day. So we would change that to 30 kilometres an hour when school is coming in or going out for the day, and 50 kilometres an hour the rest of the time. We don't, however, have variable zones around Auckland Point, Clifton Terrace or the Christian Academy up Marsden Valley at present. So we would be adding those in, and they would be 30-50 also. Then in Cable Bay, we've got a 100 kilometre an hour section on Cable Bay Road that extends also out to Marupa Road. At the moment, you travel along the state highway at 80 kilometres an hour. Arguably, the state highway has much better shoulders, much better clear zones, much safer road, and then you turn off the state highway and you're presented with a 100k speed limit either side when you turn onto Cable Bay Road. It's got ditches, it's got power poles right next to the edge of the seal. It's not a place for a speed limit of that type. So we would be we're proposing through this to lower Cable Bay Road and Maripara Road down to 80 kilometres an hour through to the existing change on Cable Bay Road where it changes to 50 kilometres an hour. So that's what we would do under the speed management plan. Now, when the final rule comes out, our lobbying or our advocacy around 30 kilometres an hour on in that home zone situation where we don't have footpaths has been successful, there would then be 17 additional urban roads that we would propose to lower to 30 kilometres an hour. Now, in Nelson, we lowered a number of roads back in 2020 down to 30 kilometres an hour, largely on the Port Hills. We applied the same thinking as to that piece of work and said, well, where else have we got that same situation? So this was really just a consistency follow-up from the work that we did in 2020 to make sure that all urban roads that are largely kind of cul-de-sacs, hillside areas without footpaths and the like would have a consistent speed limit of 30 kilometres an hour. So now I'll just hand over to Jane. She can talk through the Tasman proposal.
So in Tasman, we also will be looking at first doing our rural schools. This would be in term 1 or term 3 next year. This is generally putting a variable 30 over a 60k limit. We'd also be looking at our urban schools. This would be a variable 30 with a 50k limit. There are 4 exceptions to this. One would be Cambridge Street in Richmond, which is adjacent to the town centre. There's also Brightwater Ellis Street in Wakefield. And then whilst I was making the maps, I realised Takaka Primary School, Wadsworth Street, is one of these streets with no footpaths. Half the street is no footpaths, so we'd be taking a permanent approach for that street as well. We're also including narrow, windy, tortuous, unsealed roads. They'd be going to 60 kilometres. So in the new rule, these have been identified. 60 kilometres has been identified in the schedule, being able to be reduced to 60. So these are the roads such as Totranui, Araroa, Rameka Creek roads. We've got a range of rural residential and peri-urban roads. These roads kind of almost like new subdivision type roads that are in our rural areas that many have got 100k on them at the moment. But the whole feel of the road is very urban. They're more often than not cul-de-sacs and quite short. So we've got 77 roads which would be reducing down to between 50 or 60. We have our high-risk roads, such as the Murchie Highway, Dovedale Road, Newdorf Road, Edwards Road, and sections of the Motueka Valley Highway. That would be reducing down to 80. We've done a cost-benefit analysis on those specific roads, which has come out positive for safety reductions. And then we've got a range of about 19 specific roads, such as McShane's or around Port Tarakoe, which don't fit in any other categories, but the feedback we've had from the communities is that they've got special reasons behind why the current speed is not appropriate, so we're looking at reducing those. In addition, same as Nelson, we've got urban streets with no footpaths. There's a handful of these in Motueka and Richmond, but there's quite a few which would in our more beachside communities, such as Parapara, where we'd be looking at reductions. And then we've also got sections of the Great Taste Trail, which are over 80 kilometres at the moment, and we're looking at reducing those down to 60, but only if the new rule, if it's accepted under the new rule. And this has been, so in our submission on the new rule, we have included these exceptions as part of that submission. So all of these roads have been identified on the map that was sent out to you. There was an interactive map, so you should be able to fly around the district and kind of zoom in and zoom out on that map to look at the specifics. We have an example here. I'll hand back to Reese to talk to the Nelson example.
Thanks, Jane. So this is a Nelson example, but I think it probably equally applies to most of the urban space in the Tasman zone. So on the map, you can see there's kind of a green and yellow tiger stripe. So that denotes the fact that it's a variable speed limit. So when school is starting or ending, there would be signs that would be electronically turned up that would say 30 kilometres an hour, and those electronic signs would be typically on the main route where we have high traffic, and then on the side roads it has the same regulatory speed limit, but they would be done with static signs. So they're a sign with a bunch of print around when the times that particular speed limit applies. So you can see here, this is the zone where we've got Hampden Street Primary in the middle of the slide. We've got Nelson College and Nelson College for Girls here. And so we've got a zone of speeds around there. And at the moment, we're largely replicating what is there, although in the Hampden Street and College space, we have extended the zone just fractionally up Van Diemen Street to line up with a key walkway coming through from Fairfield Park. So I guess as we've gone through this, we've engaged with the schools, and this is an example where we've had feedback from the community around key routes and key points, gateways to schools and the like, where we can just tweak and do slightly better than what used to be there. Also on this slide, you can see the orange colour with the black border. So here's some roads, urban roads that have no footpaths. So they would be changing to 30 kilometres an hour. And you'll remember we talked about this would only happen if it was allowed under the final rules. So that would kind of be the second tranche. Now I'll hand back to Jane to talk through a rural example.
So what you see up here is, this is the Mercury Highway coming, so the thick black line coming down. So that's the Mercury Highway being reduced to 80. There's some pockets in there of rural residential, and it also shows a little bit of Apple Valley Road, which is one of the narrow, tortuous roads as well that we reduced down. So on our Tasman maps, depending on where you've chosen to look in Tasman, there's a range of things happening. So, in this map, there's a few of the schools. So I'm not sure on the pointer. Is that which one?
The top one for the pointer.
So with
your laptop.
So there is a school in here that's Upper Mercury School. So that's a 60k with a variable over the top. We've got Tasman Village. So Aporo Road, that's also reduced down to 50 out in the township, and the 60k zone's pushed out a little bit further out to where the Jester's house is. So this is just to give a quick little snapshot. But we'll move on to our slide just about our next steps. So the plan is you make your decision today, and if the Joint Committee's accepting of the resolutions, we will then submit our plan to the Director of Transport for certification, which would fully occur late July or into August. Then those changes need to be uploaded into the National Speed Limit Register, which can take up to about 8 weeks. And then implementation, we're starting next year. That's just to build in a little bit of time for if the new rule comes into place and we need to make amendments, that we can still align our implementation with the rule itself. So I'll just hand over to my colleagues, Bill and Dwayne, to...
I may just make a few additional points. One is the time we're running against. So one of the reasons this has been brought to this meeting is so that we can submit the speed management plan under the current rule while trying to line it up with the draft rule. We expect that it'll be no more than a month before the final rule is introduced, which means that we have that window to submit our speed management plan and have it certified under the current rule. I think it would be remiss of us not to mention that while what I've said is true, there is a possibility the government will change the draft rule, include new rules in it, that still require some consultation for plans that are certified now. So there is a possibility still that would have to do some limited consultation on some of the speed limit changes before they're introduced. That's not in the draft rule. We're just stressing that the final rule may include something along those lines. One of the things I know that some councillors and some members of the community wanted to see was a wider extent of 30-kilometre speed limits. Staff ultimately did not recommend that to the RTC, and the RTC adopted that as recommendations to you. And there's a few, I think, really good reasons for that. The first is the one that was pointed out by Reece. It's not permitted under the draft rule. We have no reasons for believing the government will change that in the final rule. The second is the exercise that we did with a wide range of options with the community gave us a really good sense for the nearly 2,500 submitters, what their views were on their appetite for speed limit changes. And the proposals we put up, particularly around the urban area, were the ones that were received the most support from submitters, both Nelson and Tasman, and were the only option that had a majority of supporters for Nelson and Tasman. The costs and benefits, as Reece has pointed out, show that they're largely negative, and those negatives grow the further you spread those 30-kilometre speed limits out. And if we do have to reconsult, we view the plan you approved today as our starting point for the consultation with the community. So there is no point in doing that if the final rule has a ban on 30-kilometre speed limits, and it will mean a more expedient process if we have to get to that point. And finally, I'll come back to the point about time. So we have very little time to submit this under the current rule, and trying to introduce a wider range of 30-kilometre speed limits is simply not practical. When the time we have available, you'd have to kick it probably back to the RTC and then come back to the Joint Council and get it submitted, and then submit it to the NZTA for certification. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Anything from Bill? No. Through with the chair, we'll hand it back to you.
All right, thank you. So just before I open it up and look for a mover and seconder, I'd just like to, this has been an enormous amount of work, and it's been complicated by obviously a change in government, change in philosophy, and a draft rule. I suspect there'll be lots of people, both in the community and around this table, who aren't entirely happy with every single thing. There are a lot of roads affected to one degree or another. And I suspect, well, certainly in my case, I'm not, there are some roads that I probably wouldn't necessarily agree with. However, on balance, and certainly from Tasman's perspective, I know it's been a very comprehensive process working through with the ward councillors in each location, going through the roads, discussing the proposals, what the rationale is and where they fit. And so from my perspective, I'd just like to thank all the staff that have been involved for the amount of work that's gone and the amount of information that has had to be generated, and also to the members of the Regional Transport Committee who have, I guess, been responsible for bringing through this recommendation, working through the many submissions that were provided, again, with a whole wide range of views and perspectives on the merits or otherwise. So from my perspective, I think we have landed with a recommendation that has done as best as possible to mix the submissions, the community views, and taking account of both the rule that is in place and the very clear direction from the current government through their draft rule. So with that, I will look for a mover and seconder. I'll come to Deputy Mayor Bryant firstly.
Thank you, Mayor King. Through the chair, it gives me a lot of pleasure to move this these resolutions today. This has been a long, as you've just alluded to, a long and challenging process. And it will have a huge effect going forward across both districts. But I believe we've spent time and effort to end up where most people around the table and within the communities will generally be happy with. There were, as staff have said this morning, there were a large number of submitters. And we heard from those submitters over 2 days and a wide range of viewpoints, some supportive, some not so supportive. And then in Tasman, all ward councillors had the opportunity to have input into those speeds, particularly in their own ward and in my case across wards. I'm not sure if any others got that opportunity. And so it's allowed a lot of change and will do going forward. So I would, as the Mayor has done, I'd just like to thank the staff that have been involved, the team that we have here this morning, plus Mark, and all those elected members around the Regional Transport Committee table. I will name those: Councillor Dowler, Mayor Smith, Deputy Mayor O'Neill Stevens, and then the alternate members, Councillor Ellis and Councillor Butler, Councillor Courtney and Councillor Hodgson. Huge effort they've all put in, and their efforts have been appreciated, and thanks very much for your effort, and I commend you all to support the resolutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Bryant. Mayor Smith.
A pleasure to second the resolutions. Want to acknowledge the chair of the Joint Regional Transport Committee. And it's actually been really challenging for both council staff when you've sort of got the moving ground of rules from government and trying to move this. Communities that are frustrated, that have been talking about speed limit changes since Adam was a cowboy and feel there is no progress. And at the same time, actually, this was a really complicated and important piece of work. I do think what we're trying to do today is to get that right balance between the significant and real economic cost of slowing speeds when a principal purpose of our transport system is to enable people and goods to get to places efficiently as quickly as possible, and weighing that up carefully with the very real increased safety risk. The reason I'm so comfortable with where we've landed is partly a tribute to the process. I was quite taken back by the depth of opposition to the blanket speed changes that were in the consultation document. But when you've got numbers of over 2,200 submissions and over 2/3 opposed to the blanket 30 and over 60% opposed to the blanket 40, and even just going around town centres, the opposition was 47 to 40. My view is that both our councils would be guilty of ignoring the public if we then said, well, we don't care what you think, we're just going to push on with those options. Now, it has been quite challenging, both for staff and elected members, to then get down to individual community level with all the submissions that we received. And we received passionate submissions, in my view, well-researched, well-argued, in communities like Māoriha, in communities like Ngātamoti, communities likes of in Nelson City, out at Cable Bay. And what pleases me is to see, actually, if you listen to each of those individual communities, a real effort has been made in this final plan to take that on board. And the third bit that gives me real confidence in seconding these resolutions is we can all have that opinion about where that balance is between the safety and the speed. There's nothing as robust as giving a really good economic analysis. And when we got that economic analysis in, it made the answers absolutely obvious. When you've got an option like blanket 30 kilometres an hour in Nelson City, having a cost 9 times what the benefits are, you really are in a position of going against basic economic logic to then proceed with it. It is interesting. And as we go to implement the speed management plan, I was intrigued and understand that on some of those windy rural roads that are sort of the 80 and 100 kilometres an hour, they actually do stack up from a cost-benefit basis and are included in the plan and make good sense. And we should reinforce that if there is any change in the draft speed management rules, the merits of that very robust analysis. The last thing, can I thank the officials, is man, it's difficult working through the very, very long tables and understanding which bits of which road go where. The work that has gone into providing those maps for elected representatives has made a huge difference to me, both understanding where we've landed and feeling confident that we've got it in a good balanced place. In my view, the speed management plan has got that right balance our community needs, enabling people to be able to get around without ridiculously low speed limits, being real that there is no such thing as zero risk in the real world, but actually making some really important safety gains around schools on some of our windy rural roads where, quite frankly, the current speed limits are not logical.
Thank you, Mayor Smith. So the resolution has been moved and seconded. It's now open for questions of staff, debate, or other points that people wish to make. So I've got Councillor Sampson with her hand up first, and then Councillor Courtney.
Thanks, Mayor Tim, through the chair. So I've just got a couple of questions for staff, if I may. And the first one is around the National Speed Limit Register and what, if they have any insight into what the process would be moving forward. So if, for example, there's a neighbourhood that's, you know, like got a maybe a cul-de-sac or you know, like a low kind of low use area, a low use road, or, you know, worried about running or something, and the community comes together and wants the speed lowered or considered to be lowered. Any idea what the process is going to be for that? So not a blanket change around the community, but just, you know, discrete either roads or sections of roads, cul-de-sacs, for example.
Jane.
So under the new rule, through the chair, that the speed limits for urban roads has altered. It used to be for local streets, activity streets or main streets, you could have between, I think, 30, 40, 50. Now, under the new rule, it's been altered. So it is just 50. For civic spaces, it's between 10 and 20. I understand from different councils have put in submissions about getting more detail, more granularity about the different urban streetscapes, but unless that changes under the new rule, there wouldn't be much scope in the final rule.
Okay, thanks. And so then a more kind of specific question. I understand the variable speed limit around schools, but I'm curious as to why. I looked at all of the schools in the Nelson region anyway, and it seemed to apply to pretty much all of them except for the intermediate. And I know that the backside of the intermediate, there's the Vanguard Street cul-de-sac. I just wondered why there isn't going to be variable speed there, or even why it wasn't considered to lower it to 30 kilometres, given that it's a cul-de-sac and it's, you know, the main way that kids coming from the city actually access the intermediate.
Through the chair, maybe I'll just check the maps out and come back to that question a wee bit later, if that's okay. That could be an anomaly we haven't picked up.
Yeah, I have looked at the maps. I looked at it quite carefully. So yeah, it would be. I don't need a response now, but if somebody could email me afterwards, because I basically I don't feel comfortable signing off on this if, you know, we don't have the variable speed limits around all schools.
Okay, thank you. Bill.
It's through the chair. Just adding to Jane's comment regarding changing the speed limits after this process is completed. There is an alternative method that's included in the draft rule, which is very similar to the old bylaw method, where the council can make a decision, propose that through to the director, it's certified, and then can be included into the register of speed limits. So there is an alternative process that can be used, but certainly picking up Jane's comment that 30k speed limits in urban areas would unlikely to be approved.
Okay, thank you. So Reece, you'll come back with, in regards to Councillor Sanson's point in relation to the cul-de-sac area of Vanguard Street. Okay, thank you. So I've got Councillor Courtney, Councillor Kinnamoth and Councillor Stallard. Councillor Courtney.
Well, thank you, Mayor Tim. Reece, I want to go back and continue on from where Rachel Sanson, Councillor Sanson was talking about variable speed around schools. Will this alter the existing ones if this comes through? I thought I picked up that all schools will be required to have variable speed limits around their schools. So there will be some changes, will there, in Nelson?
Through the chair, yes, that's correct. At the moment, the vast majority of our variable speeds around schools in Nelson have a regulatory speed limit of 40 as the kids go to school and come home, and 50 the rest of the time. Under this proposal here, that would drop to 30, so it'd be 30, 50. And we're adding 3 additional schools that would have variable zones around them. So that would effectively cover all schools within Nelson with the variable speed limit. Now, in the draft rule, they are talking about consistent times across the whole country for those variable speed limits, and at the moment, that's anticipated that we would adopt that. But if that slightly changed under the final rule, I imagine we would move to be consistent with that.
Just to follow up on that, so it's still unclear at the moment, Officer Reece. It's still unclear. You're still hanging, waiting for this. That's only a presumption, is it, on your part?
In terms of the times?
Yes.
Yes.
Changes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess there was considerable feedback from the transport sector in the submissions around the pros and cons of having consistent times for all schools across the country so that motorists could understand that was when you go slow outside of school versus the economics of having such a broad time frame. What we are very certain around is that we're proposing through this plan to have a variable speed limit around schools. The time frame that operates is the piece that we'd be uncertain about.
Can I have one more question, please?
You may.
Officer Reece, my memory tells me in 2021 and 2022, the Regional Transport Committee settled on option 3, I think, to go out to the community, and believing that satisfied the needs of the communities that the committee members anyway represented. Does this hinder us that the government has now, the coalition government has now blocked us from even considering options 3 and 4?
It takes it off the table, yes. I mean, that particular option is deemed as a blanket approach, which is why it hasn't been recommended by officers.
So it just can't be considered at all. Thank you very much.
Yes, Reece.
Through the chair, if I can just make one point in relation to Councillor Sanson's question around the cul-de-sac piece of Vanguard Street. I think, given that's a short cul-de-sac piece, we could include that in the variable zone under the resolution, which delegates 4A, delegates minor corrections to the chief executive just to modify the plan to make those little changes.
Okay, happy with that. Councillor Sanson, are you happy with that outcome or approach?
I am, but I've just got a subsequent very short question, if possible.
In relation to this specific?
Yes.
This specific. Yep. Sweet. Go.
If you look on that map, for the staff, if you look on that map, you've got the zone outside Victory School, and then you've got that cul-de-sac to intermediate, and then like 100 metres or something between them. Would you not just make that whole part of Vanguard Street variable?
Through the chair, we have some specific rules around the maximum length we're allowed outside the frontage of the school under the draft rule, and I imagine that will flow through into the final rule. And so that's 300 metres around a school frontage. So the cul-de-sac piece of Vanguard would fall under the Nelson Intermediate School, where the piece you were talking about falls under the primary.
Although just to follow on through the chair, the rule, the consultation document did have where practicable. So we could look at the distances and if...
Yeah, so in either of these scenarios, the particular thing can be addressed through the clause that's contained within the resolution for minor changes, and whether it ends up being a rather silly situation of having one and then a small gap in another one, which would seem a little odd. So hopefully the where practicable comes in, because ultimately I would have thought this government would be very keen on where practicable and pragmatic, because that does seem to be a bit of a theme. So that's we'll work
so
with
just
that.
To finish my question, when staff are considering that, obviously the variable one seems to be just an oversight, but can staff also consider whether that cul-de-sac actually meets the eligibility for being permanently 30 kilometres, given that it's a cul-de-sac?
Yeah, I think we'll take the approach that they will consider the best practicable option to achieve the outcome that you're suggesting, because it does seem fairly obvious that it should be one or other of those things.
Thanks,
thank
no
you.
more question.
Thank you, Councillor Sanson. Councillor Kinnemont, then Councillor Stallard.
Thank you. Through the chair. My question leads on from Councillor Courtney's question a little bit. You're going to put timeframes around the schools of when the school's open and shut. But what about when the school is closed for holidays, weekends, that sort of thing? So it's not just an hourly thing, it's that when the school is not really operating, how are you going to deal with that?
Who's answering that, Bill? Jane? Reese? Anybody?
Through the chair, at the moment, the electronic signs don't operate during the holidays. The fixed ones still have the printed times. So typically those electronic signs are on the main through road that capture the, probably 90%, 95% of the traffic. Bill's just got his nose in the rule there. I'm not sure whether he's got a further update in relation to the rule.
Yeah, okay, I'll come back to you. Councillor Stallard.
Thanks, Chair King. Just a couple of questions, if I could ask them one at a time. It's great to see that early sort of pre-consultation with schools. I wonder what kind of feedback you had from the schools around most suitable speeds, not so much outside the school gate, but further away from the school in terms of the main routes that students would cycle or walk to school. So did you receive much feedback about that?
From a Tasman's perspective, we had conversations with the schools quite early on, and those schools helped informed our option B in the urban area about when. So the option B was linking the town centres to the schools and what routes were. So those conversations informed option B. But with the introduction of the new rule, that's just something we can't progress at this time. But I'll let Reese answer for Nelson.
Through the chair, it was very similar for Nelson. Most of the conversations we had with the schools helped us develop up that option B in the urban space, which linked the schools with the nearby facilities, whether it was the hospital or the town centre or the local park, that had a broader 30k zone than what we've landed at under the current proposal.
Thanks. If I could just ask the second question.
Yes.
Thank you. Just in terms of the benefit cost analysis, I do wonder two aspects of that. How did that analysis, I guess one of the main reasons for me of reducing the speeds would be to make the roads safer, so people perceive they're safer and they'll be happier for kids to cycle to school or adults to commute to work by bike. So it's like increasing active transport. How did the analysis handle those benefits of increasing active transport, such as reduced air pollution, reduced emissions, reduced congestion, and so on?
If through the chair, the analysis was used for that was as outlined in the NZTA's monetised benefit cost manual. And that doesn't take into account those items that are really very, very difficult to monetise, such as mode shift and benefits to walking and cycling. So to be fair, it does underestimate some of those benefits, but there is no reasonable way of monetising that and including them in a benefit cost analysis. So they are items that need to be considered outside of the benefit cost process.
Thank you. And just related, if I can, so what were the main costs and how were they calculated?
Through the chair, the costs that were considered were, or the benefits and costs were safety, vehicle operating cost, travel time, and emissions. And they are all outlined in the monetised benefit cost manual and have a methodology for assessing them.
Thank you.
Thank you. So next I'll have Councillor Walker and then Councillor Mackenzie.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. First of all, thank you to all the staff involved and for all those who sat and read those numerous submissions and gave some feedback on behalf of our councils. I guess my question is, with the new coalition government, is there a clear directive around what's going to happen with kindies and preschools? Because I know that this discussion in the mahi that's gone today hasn't covered that, but I'm also mindful that particularly in our ward, we've had quite, strong messaging around the safety of our preschoolers. Is there any steer on where that work happens?
Bill, Jane.
Through the chair. So the direction from the new government is silent on kindies and ECEs. When we created the maps, if there was a kindy or ECE which was close to the school, and often they were, we did capture them in our option A and B. So under the new rule, it's because it's the speeds are restricted to the school gates. Sometimes we can pick up on a kindy if it's opposite the school, but more often than not, they're not included, unfortunately.
As a follow-up, did we include this question in our submission to the rule? Because it does seem like a very legitimate question.
It's something we overlooked.
Oh, how frustrating. Because it does seem actually remarkably obvious now it's been mentioned that whether it's a college or an intermediate or a primary school, or arguably even more importantly, early childhood education centre of whatever description, it seems an odd line to have drawn or not to have mentioned.
One of the problems with early childhood centres on a main road like Stoke, if you included that within the definition, you would effectively have it along the full stretch. The other problem with early childhood centres is they do not have the same standard opening and closing times that primary schools have. And so it's a lot more difficult to make the variable time limits work.
Okay. Righto. Thank you for the question. Councillor Mackenzie.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, I don't have a question, but just want to make the point, I think, that since 2019, when I was first elected onto council, these discussions about speed limits in our rural communities have been happening since 2019. It's unbelievable to me that actually councils operate within this bigger system that has taken this number of years to get to a point to be able to change something. And if I sit back from it, and I actually think about what is the cost to our ratepayers of everything that has gone on since 2019. I mean, seriously, I think the ratepayers would be flabbergasted. I also want to make the point that if I think about some of our rural areas, actually the people that have the best information about what are appropriate speed limits on those roads are the people that live on the roads, because they travel them every day. They see the behaviour of, people on those roads. And so I really do want to acknowledge that the contributions that we've had from our communities who have been engaged in this process for such a very long time. So it's good that Mark's on Zoom there, because actually I think the system is maybe not fit for purpose, because even when I look, in the multiple spreadsheets and, okay, well, we'll change that one. And then we're doing it now in our plan, and we're going to implement it in 2028 or... honestly, not that I'm saying I want it all implemented in 1 year, because implementation comes at an enormous cost, but I think there's maybe some changes that need to be made to the system overall.
Thank you, Councillor McKenzie. Eloquently put. Councillor Ellis.
Thank you, through you, Chair. I just too want to add my thanks to staff. This is a mammoth piece of work, and at times I think, to coin a phrase that's come out of this consultation, it's been a windy and torturous process. I'd like to reiterate Councillor McKenzie's points about a lot of our communities have been asking for a lot of these changes for a very, very long time, and I'll be really happy to support them today. For those of us who have sat in chambers and listened to the likes of Lower Moutere School, Ngāti Moti School, Hira School, it's about time. They've been waiting far, far, far too long, and these limits have come out pretty pragmatically, given the changing government direction, what our communities have asked for, and what they really need. And it's going to fix a lot of inconsistencies as well. So thank you so much for all your work, and to the communities who have submitted quite a lot on this process. So I'm really happy to be saying that we're finally moving it forward, and hopefully those in the government departments will do their bit to support us as well in this process. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Ellis. Is there anyone who hasn't spoken who wishes to speak? Because I've got a number of people who want a second crack at this, which I will come back to. Yes, I have seen Councillor Stellar's hand up, and also Councillor Courtney's.
I just have a question, that's all.
Yeah, no, it's all good. I will come back to you. I'm just checking that those who haven't spoken don't have questions or comments to make at this point. Bill?
Through the Chair, just in response to Councillor Kinnamont's question, the school travel period is defined in the Draft Act as the period between 8 a.m. and 9:30 a.m. and the period between 2:30 p.m. and 4 p.m. on any day on which that school is open for instruction. So it's any time the school's open.
Okay. Thank you. I'll go to Councillor Stallard and then Councillor Courtney.
Thanks, Chair King. Earlier I was just asking questions, but I'll debate now if that's all right.
That's fine by me.
Firstly, thanks to the staff and to the elected members on the Joint Committee for putting all this work together. Certainly acknowledge the difficulty of working through this changing environment through the GPS land transport and now the speed rule. And that sort of forced us to change direction for sure. Firstly, I'll say that we don't really have a robust economic analysis of benefit and costs of what's before us, because to my mind, one of the key outcomes that we would seek is improved safe transport choice and reduced congestion and so on via more people, school children, commuters and others, cycling or walking rather than taking the car or being dropped off in the car. We as a nation have an upcoming bill of anywhere between $2 and $24 billion to try and offset our emissions, to achieve the reductions we've pledged as part of our nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. So I think, we would be reducing that bill and any emissions reductions we can make, and certainly for NCC, the vast majority of our emissions are from transport, and I think it's a problem that we just need to tackle. I think we should also, call out the government and their role in where we've landed up today. For a government that really campaigned has spoken a lot about returning decision making to local communities. What we're seeing here with the GPS land transport and the draft speed rule is just working the absolute opposite direction to that, undermining councils and local communities and the work they've done previously, and not allowing us to work out ourselves what are safe and appropriate speeds on our local roads. The government also spoke a lot about their adverse sort of reaction to blanket speed limits. Well, we've got exactly this from the speed rule. It's like 50k in all your urban areas, take it or leave it. And that's really, to my mind, an ongoing problem in the relationship between local and central government. The speed rule, all the working around that and the GPS land transport really ignores emissions, climate, safety aside from drug testing. It is great to see the lower speeds outside schools, fantastic. But I think the problem where that's going to take us is that it's going to give the safety in that last bit of the journey for parents dropping their kids off by car. And it's just going to further cement that culture. And parents are still going to be reluctant to let their kids cycle to school because the entire journey, that part that isn't outside the school gate, is still as dangerous as ever. I think it's been unfortunate that we've seen some pretty unreliable claims bandied about the effects of speed reductions on travel times in the region, when in fact actual research shows that lower speeds in urban areas, generally result in only a very small increase in travel time, because the main sort of loss of time, if you like, is stopping for traffic lights or congestions and so on. And that's not improved by lowering the speed limits. Most of the problem with the journey is due to congestion and actual stopping. The consultation document and the process we've been through, it's also really quite silent on this well-established problem of induced demand, whereby if we make it easier or quicker to travel further and faster, obviously the mindset of people around where they live and where they work and so on changes, so they are actually encouraged to travel longer distances, and that just results in more traffic problems down the road. I think, and I will acknowledge again the constraints of the speed rule that we're working under, but this really is a missed opportunity to create safe cycling and transport choice, in that dedicated cycle lanes can be expensive, nothing like as expensive as building roads, but by reducing speed limits at a stroke of a pen almost, we are creating essentially cycle lanes, safe cycle lanes, because it is really safe cycling in an area with 30k traffic. And, at 30k, there's only a 10% chance, which is still very high, 10% chance of fatality if struck by a vehicle, but at 50k, it's 90%. And to me, that says we can really revolutionize the way we get around by reducing speeds and creating a safe cycling environment. I think we've been too passive in accepting the speed rule and not pushing back against it. And I think that the plan before us has got some great bits, and it's really good to see those rural communities in Tasman getting lower speeds. I think the direction we're heading there, if I saw the slide correctly.
You are right on 5 minutes. So.
Okay, I'll 2 more points if that's all right.
As long as they're brief.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, the direction we're going on the rural roads seems to have similar level of community support and opposition as to some of the greater reductions in speeds in urban areas. So I'll just point out that inconsistency. So overall, I don't think we're going far enough. I don't think the plan really delivers to our priorities as a council around community wellbeing, transport choice, emissions reductions. So thanking again the staff and elected members, but I won't be supporting this plan.
Thank you, Councillor Stella. Councillor Courtney.
Thank you, Mayor Tim. I think I'll let my question go by and launch into my remarks, if you wouldn't mind.
No, I don't mind.
Righto.
I'll give you a nod when you get there. If we get there.
He's far tougher than the other way.
Yeah, Tim, I'm just wondering why, oh why on earth is central government so hell-bent or obsessed with raising speed limits, leading to increased speed on our roads? I had difficulty fathoming it. This is when our communities are telling us that they want lower and safer speed limits. That's what they're telling me. I'm sure there must be others around the table they're telling that to as well. But they're crying out for slow speeds so that they can take their communities and their neighbourhoods back. They want them back, not dominated by motor vehicles taking priority over all other means of movement, transport. And this is happening in the Wood, in Nelson. Communities in east and west of Main Road Stoke, the Ridgeway, and the list goes on and on. And we all know people driving their vehicles at lower speeds saves lives. Mayor Tim, this to me is yet another example of central government intruding further into the very important area of community speed management, speed limits. That at best, in my view, is dealt with by local councils through their respective local committees on behalf of their communities. Yet we are told our communities desire less ambitious speed limit reductions. That's what we're told, less ambitious speed limit reductions. And I say to that, really? Really? Is this indeed the case? I wonder if we're reading Table 3 correctly. Is this view truly representative of the wider community? I don't think so. In fact, the impact of a crash at high speed is much more deadly than at lower speed, and that's common sense. Everyone knows that. There is a 10% risk of death if hit by a motor vehicle travelling at 30 kilometres per hour. And here's the worst one. There is a 90% chance of death when hit by a motor vehicle travelling at 50 kilometres per hour. And now we are placing supposed economic benefits and supposed efficiencies ahead of, we are placing supposed economic benefits and supposed efficiencies over life and limb. So what is the price of human life? Are we planning to do a cost-benefit analysis on that question? We, as local councils, also owe our residents and ratepayers a duty of care. We could foreseeably be creating harm through our actions, harm to them through our actions. This is one of these times when we as elected members have to stand up and be counted and lead. Life is precious. Every life lost is one too many. We must prioritise and value people and their safety before and above everything else. That's our overarching responsibility. And I urge members to be bold. Yes, and be ambitious, because we all know the outcome will be saving human life. An alternative decision is indefensible. Thank you, Mayor Tim.
Thank you, Councillor Courtney. Councillor Anderson.
Thank you through the chair. Along with everyone else, thank you, staff, for this lot of work. I'm disappointed with the recommendations. I would have loved to be able to expand 30-kilometre urban zones. I understand where you landed. It's kind of because we're not allowed to, and I really don't like being told that. The information around economics and deaths, it's all really interesting. I've been walking kids to school for 7 years now, and sometimes that's the only time I relax. So I'm pretty sure residents of the Water and the Brook aren't going to be too happy with this. We got kindies, 2 primary schools. We've got the bus outside Central. We've got the Boys and Girls College. They all walk there. I do appreciate the recommendations. I totally understand where staff landed on this, but that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Councillor Anderson. Councillor Sanson.
Thanks, Mayor Tim. I'll keep it fairly brief. I don't want to labour really excellent points that other elected members have made, but thanks particularly to Councillor Stallard and Councillor Courtney. I think much like Councillor Mackenzie, I've been around the table, I think, since these conversations began in 2019. And my recollection is that a big part of why we focused on this is because of feedback from the community and advocacy from the community around lowering speeds, particularly in their neighbourhoods and around schools and kindies. And I'm pretty disappointed that we haven't considered kindies and early childhood centres in our submission to the government on this, or anywhere really. I think one of the areas which really needs a focus is something like Tasman Street, which has 2 kindies across 2 blocks and is also one of the main routes that kids and parents with kids on bikes and on scooters and that kind of thing travel from this part, from the northeastern part of the city through to all of the kindies and schools in the city. So I agree. I think that we have been too meek in this, and I kind of look at Auckland Council, who my understanding is they kind of stood up to the government and said, well, no, we're not going to raise the speeds, that we're actually going to stick to what our community wants to hear. And I do wonder, could we not have considered being a little braver and bolder ourselves? I think that this is really a lost opportunity to make significant positive change for our community. And I really agree with Councillor Stallard that the broader economic costs and benefits haven't been considered, particularly around emissions reduction, modal shift and safety, and the kind of benefits that flow from people in the community feeling safer getting around. So I also won't be supporting this, but thanks to the staff and the ITC for all their work.
Thank you, Councillor Sanson. Anything further before I come back to the mover for a right of reply? I'll just note a couple of things that have come up in the debate. I note someone said, we're raising speed limits. So I don't think any of the suggestions that are currently on the table are raising speed limits. Yes, there is a difference between some of the options that were put out for consultation and some of the final speed limits. But we are effectively lowering speed limits on, I think, approximately 300 roads across the region. So I don't think anyone could determine or define that as an increase in speed limits. I think it's also important to note that the previous government's rule actually had the same restriction on local decision making. It was just in the reverse. So we didn't have very much flexibility around the future speed limit setting and communities' views under that rule either. It was just with the combination of the rule and the guideline and the maps that you were heading down more of a blanket. So again, I absolutely acknowledge the point that if local government wants to make those regional decisions, and that is something we should certainly be asking for. But I don't think either government took that on board in terms of their setting of their rules. They just had different approaches to how they were telling us to set the speed limits. Secondly, thirdly, I think it's also important to recognise that by and large, the recommendations that have been received, firstly by the RTC from staff, and secondly by us from the RTC, do largely follow the submissions and the majority of views that came through the 2,500 people that submitted. So I think that's also important to acknowledge. And there is also still, as much as I recognise Bill's comment about it may be difficult to go through the process, there is still a process for councils to continue to propose and promote changes to speed limits for specific roads and locations. And I would expect that if they are backed by a strong benefit cost analysis and the specific circumstances, and that if that is indeed 3 kindergartens, 2 play centres on one short stretch of road, it may well be that you can put up a persuasive case through the process. So look, I think clearly, as I said at the start, there will be a wide range of views both around the table and within the community about the specific outcomes that are being recommended today. But I do believe that given the constraints and given the conflicting approaches of the 2 central government rules that we've been required to work with, I actually think we have probably pushed the boundaries a little towards the community views versus the rule direction. And I would hope that if this joint committee actually approves this, that will be recognised through those who are being asked to certify it. So that's my 2 cents worth. Unless there's anything further, I will come back to the mover for his right of reply.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor King. Through you, just a few comments before we go to the vote. So, as I said earlier, this has been a challenging process. We're getting to the sharp end of it now. It's been ongoing for quite a number of years, which what's made it more challenging is we've had a change of process and a change of government midway through this process. I did hear Councillor Mackenzie refer to how frustrating it is. I can tell you I've spent more time frustrated about this than most things on council. I've had successive governments change how we're going to implement speed just about every term. I've spent a lot more time waiting for implementation than we ever have implementation. So I'm hoping this time we can get on and implement it under these rules as quickly as possible. We did hear from local communities. They know their roads best. One of the things that I often hear and think is that those that live on the road know what speed they want, but they always want it higher somewhere else. So it's a little challenging around how we set things, but I think we've ended in a good place, particularly around schools and urban areas and those challenging rural roads that people have been battling away for. Community councils and those have been lobbying. I can think of one at Rotorua where the community council, under a number of different options, has been battling to get that road lowered for 20 years. So hopefully under this process, we will be able to get some change. Just don't want to discount anyone's efforts around this, but I just did want to mention Mark Owen and Emma Sproats, who I missed thanking earlier on. So thank you, Mark and Emma, for your efforts through this process. And once again, thank to all those staff and who've been involved with this, what has been a long process and frustrated by a change, but we've worked through that really well, in my opinion, and ended up in a good place. And thank you again to all those elected members around the Joint Regional Transport Committee, which has been a new thing for this term. And so this is the first thing we've really worked through together as a joint committee. And I alert you to support the resolution to show it's been a success. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Mayor Bryant. So we'll now move to the resolution. following Nelson City Council standing order process. So does anyone wish to call a division? Councillor Courtney, so the vote will be done by division. So I'll come over to the administration staff to take us through the division process. So just before I ask Richard to read the names, everyone clear? Excellent, thank you.
Okay, Councillor Anderson. No. Councillor Bench.
Aye.
Councillor Brand.
Aye.
Councillor Bryant.
Aye.
Councillor Butler.
For.
Councillor Courtney.
No.
Councillor Dakey.
For.
Councillor Dowler.
For.
Councillor Ellis.
For.
Councillor Hodgson.
Aye.
Councillor Kinnernoth.
For.
Mayor Tim.
For.
Councillor McKenzie.
For.
Councillor Mailing.
For.
Councillor Maru.
For.
Councillor Pakipaki.
Aye.
Councillor Sanson.
No.
Councillor Shellcrest.
For.
Councillor Skinner.
For.
Councillor Stallard.
No.
Councillor Walker.
For.
Mayor Nick.
So the resolution is carried 18-4. So thank you. Thank you for everyone's contribution, as particularly just to all those who have been involved in this through the RTC for a considerably longer period and at a level of detail than the rest of us. And we will now draw the meeting to a close, and I will finish the closing karakia. Kia horo te marino, kia whakapapa panamu te moana, aroha atu, aroha mai, tēnā tātou, tēnā tātou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you.